For our next speakers, we're going to have Phillips Johnson and Ryan Howells. Phillips Johnson is from b.well and Ryan is from the CARIN Alliance. A little bit more about their topic. So the CARIN Alliance has developed the CARIN IG for Blue Button FHIR implementation guide in order to assist payers who are implementing the CMS interoperability and patient access rule. And so today, Phillips and Ryan will be discussing the rule from the application perspective, including application registration best practices, the CARIN Code of Conduct, myhealthapplication.com, as well as other topics specific to how the applications are currently accessing data on behalf of individuals today.
Hey, thanks, Christina. Appreciate the opportunity. Can I go ahead and share my screen as well? Thank you so much. Phillips and I are pleased to be here today to talk a little bit about patient applications. There was a lot talked about in that last session that we'd like to get to as well. There's a lot going on right now. And fundamentally, what we're doing is we're actually rebuilding the entire health IT ecosystem and finding ways where we're going to build it on a modern internet-based API economy. And that is going to be significant in many different respects. And we want to talk to you a little bit about the CARIN Alliance, what we're working on, how we've been involved in these two rules that have now come out. And Phillips and b.well have been instrumental in that process. And we're going to take it really from the app angle. We have had portals in healthcare for quite some time, but we have not had apps in forever. And so we now have apps. Apps can now connect via APIs like they do in the rest of our world. With finance and other areas of our life. And so we're excited to talk to you about what that looks like. So first, a little bit about who we are. We used to need to introduce ourselves. Now that we've been named in a final CMS regulation, we don't necessarily need to as much anymore, but just so you know, we are an alliance. I work for a company called Levitt Partners who formed this alliance with Anish Chopra and David Brailer, David Blumenthal, Governor Levitt about 4.5 years ago with the express purpose of finding ways where consumers, caregivers can be able to easily get, use, and share their digital health information where, when, and how they want to achieve their goals. At the time when we did it, it was before 21st Century Cures had passed. It was before CMS had even contemplated actually developing the rule related to patient access. But it was during the time when providers had already started moving down this path of API access. And so this is really significant because for the first time, what we have is we now have both the providers and the payers on a similar technology standard, these FHIR APIs that allow for them to be able to develop a FHIR API gateway and then have the ability to then be able to exchange data similar to what we do in the internet world today. It's certainly significant in many respects. We have a group of about 70 organizations participating in this. You can see some of the information we've got on carinalliance.com. 7 of the 10 largest payers in the country, including most of the major Blues plans, all the EHR vendors, either directly or through their association, Google, Apple, Microsoft, many other companies too, from pharma companies to app companies like b.well and Humetrics and GoodRx and others. So a really robust set of participants who are all focused on this exclusive goal of how we advance business to consumer data exchange. And one of the first questions we get is, well, why would we need to do this? Why is this important? And I think to sum it up in one sentence, it's that for too long, we've taken an organizational-centric approach to healthcare, and now it's time to take a person-centric approach. Every organization does a good job, I think, of providing the information that's within their individual system, but we've never been able to truly aggregate health information at the person level. And the person is the only constant in healthcare. So across both providers, across payers, now this administration is building on the good work of previous administrations in finding ways to actually do that at scale. So our focus today is just on the CMS interoperability and patient access final rule. This has been going on for quite some time. For payers, it's fairly new. But back in the Q4 of 2017, the White House invited a few healthcare executives and thought leaders to the White House to talk about what could we do that's highly bipartisan, that's totally needed to move to value-based care, that would be industry supported, and that could be really person-centric, that could really drive value. And overwhelmingly, the answer was interoperability, person-centric interoperability. What does that look like? So today, we're not going to focus on all the parts of the rule itself. We're going to just talk about this patient access API component. And Phillips is going to talk a little bit about his experience of registering apps in the provider world, and some best practices around that. So I'll get to that as we go through the slides in just a minute. So first of all, how do we put all this together? And I know this is confusing for folks that haven't been involved, but one thing I do want to say is that there was a comment that was made in the previous session about where are people congregating. I would say people are mainly, from a technology perspective, congregating at HL7. So if you're not involved in HL7, I know you may be involved in WEDI or EDI or some of the other things that are going on. That's also important. But for this conversation, I would strongly recommend participating in the HL7 community, because HL7 owns FHIR. FHIR is a foundational technology that's being used. That's where you can get the most help. There's a lot of open chat rooms and other things that you can get help in. There are also what's called FHIR accelerator programs like DaVinci, CARIN, Argonaut, and others as well that are out there that allow for you to then be able to participate with other implementers in how these technology standards are being implemented and how they're being validated, and questions that you may have. There are 3 core implementation guides or use cases that are required by the patient access API rule. And sometimes we don't remember all 3, but the 3 that are included in the rule is formulary, clinical data, and claims data. And in supplemental guidance, CMS offered the payer community different implementation guides that they may use on a volunteer basis to be able to provide this information to their members. And the industry is really rallying around these 3 implementation guides. For formulary, it's the DaVinci Formulary Implementation Guide. Again, this is all listed on the CMS website. For clinical data, it's the DaVinci PDEX Payer Data Exchange or USCDI implementation guide to provide that clinical data to the individual user. And for claims data, it's the CARIN implementation guide for Blue Button, which we're going to talk about a little bit today. And I know Amol is going to follow us a little bit, and 2 more speakers to talk about it in much more detail, so you'll get a good understanding about it. But this is where CARIN plays a role. We also have another implementation guide that we like to call Real-Time Pharmacy Benefit Check that has been validated by HL7. It's an STU1 version that's out there, and and published an ST1 version. What the formulary implementation guide does is it actually provides information for an individual who's wanting to select a plan. Is my drug in this specific coverage type is really the question that it helps answer, among others. But once someone is actually in a plan and selected a coverage type, the CARIN Real-Time Pharmacy Benefit Check Implementation Guide will then provide the individual with real-time information about how that drug has actually affected their formulary and benefit information, their out-of-pocket costs, what their therapeutic alternatives may be, and what their cash price could be if they decide to go cash price or formulary. In fact, 50% of the time, paying cash sometimes is actually cheaper than using your benefits. So, and that's one of the reasons GoodRx is actually part of the work that we are involved in too. So we're working with a lot of PBMs right now to implement their FHIR API gateways, and over time we see both the DaVinci Formulary IG as well as the Real-Time Pharmacy Benefit Check ID, both of them being supported by the PBM and the health plan community, so folks can get that real-time access on how those drugs are being applied in their benefits. So let's talk about trust, and then we're going to talk about app registration specifically. So again, another question that we get frequently is there's like 500,000 health apps that are in the App Store. Are they all going to come knocking on our door day one? The answer is no. Just b.well will, right, Phelps? No. There are not 500,000 apps that are that have production API access to this data today. There are about 60 that have connected to CMS Blue Button API, or that have connected to Epic or Cerner or some of those other ones 60 consumer-facing apps that have actually connected in production with the FHIR APIs, and b.well is one of them, and Phillips is going to talk about this. The next question that we get is, but what if they're nefarious? What if they do horrible things with our data? That is certainly a risk that's out there, but I will tell you it is a minimal risk, because for the folks that we have spoken to, privacy and security is absolutely fundamental to their business model. If they lose the privacy, the security, the trust of their individual member, they lose their business. And so many of them, even though they don't have to, are running out and getting high trust certified or getting certified wherever they may be. And so with that background, we said, well, the way this works is when data actually moves from the HIPAA protected environment to the FTC regulated environment, what happens is that falls under FTC section 5A, which says do no harm to the consumer, and we're only going to enforce the terms and conditions that are found in the app's terms and conditions set of privacy policies. Well, that's the problem, because if the app vendor says, I'm going to sell your data to North Korea without your consent, and as long as they put in the terms and conditions of their privacy policy, FTC can enforce that. We said, absolutely, that's not acceptable in healthcare. So what we did is we developed what's called the CARIN Code of Conduct. And when we spoke to FTC commissioners and others in the FTC space, they had mentioned to us that as long as the industry rallies around a single set of best practices or a code of conduct, we as the FTC can go out and enforce that. In fact, there's case law that actually is seeing that happen in other industries. So we did that. We have rallied around the CARIN Code of Conduct. We're going to talk about that here in a second, about what that looks like and who has adopted that, which means that even though these apps have only voluntarily attested to the CARIN Code, it can be enforceable by the public sector as well as the private sector. And so this becomes super important as we start to move data between regulatory frameworks. We're also on the second phase of what we're doing in our kind of our trust framework is this questionnaire. Customers and consumers need a place where they can go and find an app that is relevant and applicable to their own specific privacy preferences. Some are okay. If they have stage 4 lymphoma, they want their data out there in a way in which they potentially can find a solution and find a way to extend life. And that's super important to them. Others are super protective of their data. We need to create, which is totally fine as well, we need to create an environment that works for everybody. But it needs to be a consistent environment whereby you can find an app that is consistent with your own privacy and consent preferences. And so that's where the questionnaire comes in. And finally, validation. We're working with third-party validation organizations right now that will, like ENAC, for example, who does HIPAA-like validation, who can actually validate these apps and be able to certify that they are doing what they said that they would do in following the CARIN Code of Conduct. Again, all of this is voluntary because it's in the FTC space, but what we are finding is both apps and consumers are really running to find ways where they can secure this data regardless of where it sits. And I will tell you, and I know this seems pretty amazing to think about right now, we believe actually moving the data into this space, the FTC space, is going to increase the level of privacy, security, and consent that you have related to this data, even above and beyond what it is in HIPAA today. So where do you find this information, and who has actually attested to this information? Well, we have an app gallery. It's on a website called myhealthapplication.com, where you can go and search these apps that have actually attested to the CARIN Code of Conduct. There's b.well right there. There's one up as well at the top. It's good that you guys are at the beginning of the alphabet too, by the way. It's all in alphabetical order related to that. And there's other apps that are out there too that have attested the CARIN Code. These are folks that have been with us for quite some time, that have been part of our work and our development process, and that could be trusted. These ones over here on the VA Lighthouse, for those of you who don't know, VA actually has an API gateway that they offer called Lighthouse, and they register apps as well. And they, as it shows here, is a supporter of the CARIN Alliance Code of Conduct. Carry Quality also is a supporter of what we are doing. And I could go on and on. CMS Blue Button has a lot of the content that we provide in the CARIN Code of Conduct in their Blue Button 2.0 registration process and more. So we're super excited because it has become the de facto standard for how apps should handle data outside the HIPAA construct. And as a result of that, we hope to increase and grow that over time and get more industry input about how we can improve it as well. So let's talk about app registration. Here's where I'd like to bring Phillips in after I kind of get through this slide. But as a baseline, what we're trying to do is app registration is a new concept, obviously, for data holders and especially for health plans. And long term, we don't want health plans in the business of registering apps. That's a bad business for you to be in. We want you to advance value-based care and do everything else that you do really well. But we recognize that at least initially, there's going to be kind of a manual process or a baseline process for how to do this. And then over time, we hope to move that to more of an automated process. From kind of this manual process, this baseline process, Blue Button Sandbox actually does a really good job, and so does Epic, about creating a developer's portal or sandbox for actually how to do this. We would, there's others that do this well too, but those are two really good set of best practices for how to create that developer's portal or sandbox. We mentioned the CARIN code of conduct. A lot of it is found in the Blue Button checklist. It's actually online. There's a link there, and we talked about My Health Application. We also talked about educational materials for consumers. That is actually a requirement under the CMS rule, is to provide those educational materials. And Epic does a good job about doing that as part of the OAuth process. So as part of that OAuth process, there's some patient education about what that app is doing with the data and what you're essentially attesting to in and authenticating to for gathering that information to the app of your choice. The other thing, and I know Phillips will talk about this, is a register once, access all principle. One of the challenges that the provider community had is because these large EHR vendors, some of them are custom installs in a client site, they had to develop custom interfaces to each one of their clients over time. And that became very problematic because as these apps went and registered with one EHR vendor centrally, then they had to go ask, and they're still actually having to go ask permission from every single one of their clients to access that information. Well, that's not a good best practice. We want the app to go in, to register once, to go through this process of providing demonstration, other things, and then to be able to access, if there are multiple endpoints, all of those endpoints. Hopefully for health plans, there's only one endpoint to be able to access that. And then finally, using the Smart App Launch framework. Most people, if not all of the payer community, is new to Smart. It is not new to the provider community. They've used it for quite some time, and the apps have used it too for quite some time. It uses a derivative of OAuth to actually enable the authentication process to occur. Smart is really important because if we don't use Smart, then the apps who are connecting on the provider side aren't able to also use the same authentication process to connect on the payer side. And so we're encouraging everybody to use that authentication process to make that happen at scale. But Phillips, let me bring you in here. What else would you edit on this list, or what other things are you seeing in production that could be able to help the group?
Sure. Yeah, I think, this is a great list for anyone who's kind of setting out to create, the ability for applications to register. It's very important as a payer that you build a sandbox that these applications can kind of develop against. And so when you work with your engineering teams to kind of build this process out, one, you want to make sure that you have kind of a realistic sandbox that is providing real data that applications can use to validate that their approaches work correctly. FHIR is great in that it is a standard, but it is also a standard that can be heavily customized. So as you validate your FHIR responses, applications need to make sure that they're interpreting the data the exact way that you want it to be interpreted, and they're showing the right place in the right information in the right place. So having that ability to easily get access to a sandbox and then elevate your way up into production is extremely important. As Ryan mentioned, ideally we want one endpoint that can access all of the information, but as you roll this out, if you do end up having multiple identity systems or multiple kind of adjudication systems that are going to need to be tapped into this, and these require different endpoints, you need to make it very obvious which endpoints represent which data. So one of the issues that has existed in the provider space is giving applications easy insight into kind of these base URLs, as they're often called, that show us exactly this information is found at this endpoint, and this is what that endpoint represents, whether it's this state's medical advantage plans or all of our MA or hopefully in the future also all our commercial lives.
Great, Phillips, thank you. We also believe that over time, we are going to get to a very trusted ecosystem. We believe that we will be able to automate the process of app registration over time by using a standards-based approach, registration with other trusted endpoints, this attestation to industry codes of conduct. All of these things are going to help us develop actually a trusted ecosystem for automatically being able to register these apps. There is an approach right now, an open source standard called UDAP that we have listed in this Google Doc. It's also part of our implementation guide that we'd love for input on. And we're looking for folks to test on that if you'd like to be able to test. And we're also looking to increase the authentication protocols associated with how individuals actually authenticate. And there's a W3C standard called WebAuthn or FIDO2, which actually eliminates the need for usernames and passwords completely. It actually does the cryptographic key in your phone plus the biometric in your finger as the two factors that actually authenticate you in. And so these new standards, it's actually being adopted by every single major Android, iOS, and Microsoft different platform in the country. And so these two standards are really helpful as we move forward in trying to advance the ability to authenticate individuals in a significant way. I won't get a lot into identity, but I just wanted to let you know that we're working on it. We had an ONC and CMS summit in last year that talked about identity. The only thing I'd say about really identity is it's different than patient matching. It actually means true mobile identity. And the best way to think about this is kind of a mobile driver's license. There are 14 states that are in some way of actually implementing the mobile driver's license standard today. Think about a world where you as an individual have your own person-centric identity. It may be government issued, it may not be. And you can share only the information you'd want to share with an independent third party to actually authenticate you into a system. And so we're super excited about doing that. We're working with the folks that are developing these standards and finding ways where we can move to more of from an organizational centric identity to a person centric identity. Right now, SMART uses the credentials that are associated with your portal, which is great. But the problem is that if you have 20 or 30 different portals, memorizing all those usernames and passwords become different. What if you could just have one authentication mechanism, one identity, and that one identity could be used across multiple systems? And that's the kind of the reality of the world that we're looking to create. Phillips, as you guys are thinking about and have members that actually have used SMART, can you just talk about specifically just the barriers associated with getting portal usernames and credentials a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So obviously portal name, user, and passwords is not ideal in terms of what people are looking to use in terms of getting an optimal user experience. Portal adoption in this country is very low. It's a little higher in the payer space compared to the provider space, but for those who don't have it, having to kind of go create an account and then come back and register and do all this is just not a very seamless process. Also, for someone who is a high utilizer, it is a lot of username and passwords they have to remember, and it creates a lot of confusion, and it also makes setup very difficult for these users. So having the ability to effectively ID proof and ID authenticate once, and being able for the ecosystem to kind of automatically recognize that that user is who they say they are, create that trusted identity, and reach out to all these various payers and providers is really what's going to push the industry forward as a whole in terms of users being able to quickly step in and get access to their information and allow third parties to really drive value in the ecosystem.
Thank you. Christine, I know we've got some questions.
Awesome. Yeah. One of the questions that we had from the audience is what types of apps can health plans expect to be using with these patient access APIs next year? And then what is the expected volume?
I'll take that one. So I think, in terms of consumer applications, the reality is that there's a lot of different ones looking to do a lot of different things. You have companies like b.well ourselves that are really trying to create a digital front door for our kind of sponsor clients and for those hospital systems and health plans that utilize us as their consumer front end. You also have a lot of applications that are very kind of what I would call niche focused, or, also sometimes referred to as digital therapeutics. So they're very focused on maybe dealing with the diabetic population or dealing with an asthma condition, or really kind of focused on one specific thing. I think the breadth is going to be quite large in terms of the amount of approaches and what they're looking to customize on. And that goes into a lot of the specific permissioning that is possible through the Smart on Fire framework. Beyond that, in terms of volume, I think that's very hard to predict. I think if, assuming these plans continue to roll out this across their commercial value, we believe that the demand will be quite high. To put an exact number is going to be difficult. I think CMS could probably publish some usage data and serve as a baseline for that. But, obviously their population is probably not going to be as heavily utilizers of technology as others, though that's not necessarily true and could be a very false statement in some capacities. So it's really difficult to put an exact number on volume.
Christina, there's a great question out here. You've been active? It says, do you see follow-ons to the CMS and ONC rules to drive the next round of innovations? I'm going to actually allow Denise to talk about that because she's up next. But I think that's really, I think the administration's been pretty clear, as has been future administrations. This is a process. It's not a destination. And so I know she'll talk about that briefly. But are there other questions, Christina, that we could be helpful with?
Yeah, another question from the audience is, what is b.well's experience with CMS Blue Button 2.0? And how would that play or not into the new patient access API?
All right, 1 second. My fire alarm's going off in my building.
Let me just mention just real briefly, Christina. So Blue Button 2.0, the CMS Blue Button 2.0 interface is built off of Fire Release 3. And the ones that CARIN has built is off of Release 4. Phillips, I think you're off mute now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I am. Sorry about that. So I think that's a great point to start. There's the move from STU3 to R4 that's taking place. Almost every payer that's on this call should be looking at R4. Know that R5 is not too far away. So when you think about implementing it, you need to know that there is a concept of versioning. R4 was the first normative release of Fire. So going forward, versions should be backwards compatible, which will provide value. But there is that different handling of versions that is required. Also, CMS started originally largely with the explanation of benefits object model and has been moving into the clinical side of things. There's a lot of other things that exist in payer lines that CMS hasn't dealt with as much, particularly when you think about proxies and handling kind of everything that's associated with that. There's a lot of kind of more advanced implementations that we expect to see kind of in the Medicare Advantage side. So I would say, if you can integrate with CMS and handle all their endpoints and all their clinical endpoints, you're maybe 60, 80% of the way there, but there's definitely a long tail of, being able to continue to kind of increase that capability. And there are a lot of clinical endpoints that CMS has not implemented yet that are part of US Core.
And then another question we had is, are health plans allowed to vet and analyze a third-party app registering for using APIs prior to approving them?
The keyword vetting, yes. So the answer is, it depends on how you define it. So they're not allowed to vet the apps. And when I say the word vetting, I mean actually tell the app no, unless the app presents a security risk to the organization, or if they do not follow the actual standards that are listed in the CMS rule. And again, you've got the expert coming up here that is going to correct anything I said, Denise. But I will say that when we talk about vetting in CARIN, we talk about it in terms of actually app registration. So there is an app registration process that we encourage all payers to go through. And that includes things like, we should have a meeting with the app vendor themselves. They should have it do a demo of the app itself. They should also be able to have access to a test sandbox so that they can test the API endpoints with our version of Fire that's there. Those are all realistic expectations of the app community. Phillips, what else would you add there as far as other best practices?
Yeah, I think it's definitely important for health plans to understand the apps and what they're looking to do. Within reason, right? It's more than fine to kind of create a standardized kind of set of questionnaires or security questionnaires that can be due. But as Ryan mentioned, there is a fine line between, vetting, which is kind of a dangerous word, and also, blocking, right? So you don't want to make sure the process is too cumbersome to fall under blocking. And also you got to make sure that the security protocols are actually appropriate. So I think that's, something the industry is going to work its way through in the coming years. For the, those who don't know, using HITRUST is a good example, and b.well is HITRUST certified, but HITRUST certification is expensive and it takes a long time, and a lot of kind of newer apps are not going to be able to do that. And so you need to be able to kind of go through that process and say, is this a realistic expectation, or is this a blocking mechanism from a registration perspective, and that it's unreasonable for someone who may be doing everything correct but just can't afford the $100,000 and 12, 18 months it takes for someone to kind of go through HITRUST. So it is a dual-edged sword, and something that the industry needs to develop best practices around.